tonight we're going to continue. All right. So this is the official kickoff of the training. Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you all in Dover. We're going to be talking about complete streets tonight. We're going to talk about general concepts. We're going to talk about infrastructure, policy, implementation. There's a lot to get through. As I said, I will stop periodically and ask if anybody has questions. But a little bit of background on me and the training. I've spent my entire career working on issues of active mobility. And in 2018, we worked with NYSERDA to develop the state's first official training course for municipal planning boards and elected officials around active transportation complete streets. The New York State Department of Health got wind of this and provided grant funding so that we're able to offer these trainings for free in communities throughout New York State. So we're really grateful to have this program. There's been a lot of great discussion in communities of all scales, cities, villages, hamlets, towns, and everything in between. So we have a lot of experience doing this. We love doing active mobility work and helping New York communities realize what complete streets means. So, having said that, let's kick things off. First, defining complete streets and active transportation. Before I get into that, I want to give everybody a little bit of a disclaimer because, different audiences have different priorities and different ways of thinking. First and foremost, streets are public spaces by definition, just like a local park, just like a recreation center. These are places that are operated and maintained by tax dollars. So it is up to us to determine what the highest and best use of our public spaces is going to be. Yes, I am a cyclist, and yes, I specialize in this type of stuff, but I'm not here to tell you that you could be ripping out all your parking and putting in bike lanes and curb extensions and speed bumps and all this. That's not my goal today. My goal is to help you think through how you can transform your streets or public spaces into economic development engines that produce higher social safety and public health outcomes. We also want to, make sure that we are creating spaces where people want to live and work and play. So that's what I'm here to do tonight. There are a lot of tools to achieve that highest and best use, but ultimately it depends on what your priorities are and what you're trying to achieve. Yes, bike lanes are a tool. Yes, removing parking is a tool. But maybe it's not the tool that's right for you. So we're going to talk about all that as we go. A lot of content to cover, so here we go. So what is active transportation? According to the CDC, active transportation is any self-propelled, human-powered mode of transportation. And what's interesting about this definition is not so much what it's saying as where it's coming from. It's coming from the CDC, not DOT, not somewhere else. And the reason that CDC is interested in active transportation is because physical inactivity is a lead contributor to many chronic health conditions in the United States, including obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. And active transportation is a potential tool that we can use to reduce some of these risk factors. If we zoom in specifically on obesity, what we find is that in 1997, just over 40% of New York State adults classified as overweight or obese. In 2016, that number jumped to 60%, so this is growing. In terms of cost, the state comptroller did an analysis in 2011 looking at the cost of obesity to the state, and they found that the cost of childhood obesity was $327 million, and the cost of adult obesity was $11.8 billion to the state. And that is a huge number. And the reason that I bring this up is because a lot of communities that I go to think about things like complete streets and say, we can't afford this. This is great, but this is important. What are we supposed to do? When I see a number like 11.8 billion, I think, we can't afford not to be thinking about ways to increase our physical activity. So, as you'll see later, complete streets is something that can be achieved with little to no cost in some cases. So that's just something to think about in terms of framing this financially. Now, if we start to think about physical inactivity, why is this occurring? Part of the reason is because Americans are spending more and more time in their cars because commute times are getting longer. And there's a variety of reasons for this. So there's population growth, there's congestion, there's really poor state of good repair. But that means that there are opportunities to reduce the amount of time that we're spending in cars. Maybe you can reduce your commute time by switching to a bike, or you can at least avoid congestion. And indeed, when we look at mode share, it's abundantly clear that those travel times are predominantly in our cars, right? 53% of workers are driving alone for their commute to work. And this graph is a misnomer. This is according to 2019 data, and includes New York City, where 75% of people use public transit every single day. So if you removed New York City from this equation, this number here would likely be in the 80s or 90s, particularly in the more rural areas of our state. So if the CDC is right and active transportation is a tool for reducing our inactivity and getting us moving, why aren't more people getting out of their cars and jumping on bicycles or walking? Well, you can take your pick. There's a lot of reasons, whether it's poor pavement conditions, lack of safe infrastructure, wide intersections, congestion, fear of collision. All of these things prevent people from engaging in transportation. And while some of these may be achieved, they are not unfounded. If you look at safety data in New York State, what you find is fatalities for bicyclists and pedestrians have remained somewhat flat. And what's striking to me in a post-COVID context, you look at 2020 here and here, pedestrian fatalities and injuries are on the rise again, back to, well, at least in injuries, back to pre-pandemic levels. We did see a significant drop in injury because there were less people on the road for a time in 2020. A lot of people were just staying home and not going anywhere. But this is a striking number. When we talk about cyclists, again, fatalities are relatively flat for 10 years. And worse yet, injuries are beginning to increase to their highest amount in 10 years. So the barriers that I talked about on the last slide are very real. And then if we zoom in and we look at where these pedestrian fatalities are taking place, 25% of them are happening at intersections. And that is a very clear indication of design deficiency, right? So intersections are places where we expect pedestrians to be able to cross the street. So if that's where a quarter of fatalities are happening, then something's wrong with our intersections. So what do we do about it? Complete streets is a solution to some of these safety challenges. So what is complete streets? Complete streets are streets that are designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities. Sort of visualize that, complete streets are streets for everyone. When we do them correctly, we are economic vitality. We are creating equitable streets that everyone has access to. We're increasing safety. We are being environmentally conscious, and we're making sure that the streets are covered with trees. We don't have drainage issues. Providing optimal transportation choices. We're ensuring mobility for everyone, regardless of ability. We're increasing the livability of our community. We're creating a place where people want to hang out and be. And lastly, we're increasing public health outcomes. When we think about complete streets, I mentioned earlier streets as public space. Well, complete streets is also about efficiency. And I think this is a very stark image here. If you look at a busload of people and you put them on a roadway, this is how much space that they take up, this single bus. When you take that same busload of people and you put them on bikes, this is how much space they take up. But then when you put each of those bus riders in a car, suddenly you have no space left on the roadway. So I would pose the question to you, which of these images is the highest and best use of that public space? Now, having said that, sure, transit is the most efficient means of transportation here. Sure, this is a dense urban context, right? My point here is not that we should be all getting on the bus or hopping on a bike. My point is, if we look at this streetscape here, what would happen if we create an environment that enables half of these people not to drive and maybe take a bus or bike? Suddenly, you would just have 2 lanes of traffic and you'd be able to use these outer lanes here for any number of purposes, whether we're talking about street seating for restaurants, whether we're talking about a bike lane, a protected bike lane, or a dedicated transit lane. If we mix and match modes, right, and we try to achieve different modes of transportation, we're creating more efficient use of our space. From an environmental standpoint, most of New York State's come from transportation. So, as we saw in the mode share chart, that's primarily people driving single occupancy vehicles and not doing anything else. So if we can offset some of those car trips, get more people on transit, get more people walking, get more people biking, we can start to take a chunk out of this 34% of state emissions. From an equity standpoint, driving or owning a car is very expensive. I found this out the hard way when the pandemic hit. We had a baby, so I suddenly needed a car, and you think about insurance and parking and fuel. In 2015, the average cost of owning a vehicle was $8,500 a year. That was 2015, and now we're in 2022 with inflation. Surely that number is much higher, which creates a significant barrier for a lot of people who might not be able to afford a car. And ultimately, in places where that's the only option, we're really leaving people out and creating more challenges for people who can't afford this. Placemaking is another important concept with complete streets. So how do we create an environment where people want to do business? How do we create an environment where people want to hang out and create a lively atmosphere? And then lastly, freight mobility is a really key consideration here. This often gets left out of the conversation, but all of our businesses need to get goods somehow. And the essential idea here is, how do we avoid something like this and think more about this? Or how do we get trucks to our businesses more efficiently without creating disruption? Can we design for that? And a case study that I like to talk about is Hamburg, New York, which is in Western New York. There are lots of good examples of complete streets in New York State, but this is one of the earliest ones. So this is a town that went into decline after the collapse of the steel industry and in the opening of a nearby mall. The population was approximately 10,000. In 2001, New York State DOT, who owns this roadway, which happens to be their main street, was going to come in and do a quote unquote street improvement project, which would have added a lane of traffic and shortened the sidewalk. So in order to accommodate that extra lane, they would have had to cut back these sidewalks. And the local residents didn't like that, as you might imagine. So they put together a citizens advisory committee. They developed their own design solutions. And ultimately, they developed a design which included this safety lane, which is ultimately a bike lane. There are roundabouts at either end of this 1 mile stretch of their main street. There's mid-block crossings, lots of great safety features. They added street trees. And what's amazing to me when I think about this case study is not so much the design as much as the outcomes. So between completion in 2009 and 2013, car accidents on this street fell 60%. and the number of injuries, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Car accidents fell 66%, and the number of injuries fell 60% on this 1 mile stretch of roadway. From an economic development standpoint, in 2005, while they were developing this plan, there were 15 building permits at the time. And in 2010, after just 1 year of this implementation, there were 96 building permits on Main Street. There was also a lot of civic engagement that popped up, including garden walks, a street music festival, a garden like soapbox derby. So in essence, you see the results here. You see how a more people-centric design can be safer, can create that lively economic development context and inspire civic engagement. So there's a couple tools here. If you're going out and doing walk audits, there's a lot of tools online. I'm sure Emily and Tara have a lot of tools that they're going to be deploying while you guys are out in the field. But this MAPS mini audit tool is a great little like hand tool if you're doing a walk audit. Similarly, I know this is a New York City resource, but there's a lot of really interesting sidewalk treatments out there that are great to be thinking about. So this guide has a lot of points for inspiration. So before I go into infrastructure, I'm going to pause there. That's the overview of what Active Transportation Complete Streets is generally. Are there any questions? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to keep going. So this section is focused on complete street design, what it looks like, how do we get there, what should we be thinking about, and what are the specific tools that we use. So the first thing when we're thinking about what to do where, we want to recognize patterns in our community. So are there goat paths? And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a goat path. It's sort of a evidence of informal travel. Or informal paths that people take. So maybe there's a path that people walk through a field frequently. That's something to think about. Clearly, people have found a path of least resistance. Maybe that's something we should formalize. Bikers tend to like to vet their routes and find the path of least resistance. So how do they get to transit? How do they get to local stores? That's going to tell you a lot about how you might want to think about planning a bike network. Every community I've ever been to has sort of whispers of projects that have been around since God knows when. Like, oh yeah, that rail trail, they've been talking about converting that to a trail since the 70s. And, oh, that intersection's always been a problem, blah, blah, blah. These conversations stay alive for a reason. And for us as people thinking about improvements, we should be thinking about those questions. We should be thinking about those sort of rumblings and vetting them to see, oh, okay, there's actually an issue here, or there's an opportunity here for us to capitalize on. And lastly, and most importantly, where are the kids hanging out? Do we have safe routes to our schools and to our playgrounds? Because that's really key. Kids are a really vulnerable population, and we want to make sure that it's safe and easy to get to the library, to get to school, to get to parks. So once we've started to think about patterns in our community and things that we want to address, we then start to think about design. Now, I like to think of this as a sort of modular stepladder here. And the way that you prioritize different modes informs how you design and invest in your streetscape. So for example, in a dense urban downtown context, you might see a stepladder that looks like this, which prioritizes walking and biking first, and then transit, and then taxis, and then private cars and parking. I'm not saying that this is the right prioritization for Dover, and frankly, it might look different in different parts of a community. Let's say maybe in certain areas, you want to prioritize walking and biking, and there is no transit, so the car comes next. However you arrange this stepladder, once you figure out what your mode prioritization is, there is an entire menu of design solutions for those modes. So again, if walking is most important to us, we're going to prioritize investments in sidewalks, crosswalks, wayfinding, streetscaping, etc. Same with biking, we're going to think about bike lanes, bike parking, trails, counters, etc. That's how we start to think about design and prioritization. If you leave here with one soundbite, I suppose it should be this, and that's correct design invites correct usage. And you see a pretty good example of that here, whereas you have this wide open street with no crosswalks. This guy can jaywalk wherever he wants. These cars are, they have lots of space, so there's no clear positioning on the street. Versus this, a very orderly intersection. There's a very clear space for someone to cross. There's a safe landing at the end of the crosswalks. There's a clearly defined space for cars to drive in. It's just a lot more predictable. So the first sort of design concept we're going to talk about is a road diet. So what's a road diet? So for decades and decades, road design has been focused on maximizing space for cars. Lanes were designed really wide to give plenty of space and enable higher speeds. But here's the deal. Cars aren't that big unless you're driving a tractor trailer truck, and they don't really need that much space. So the idea of a road diet is how can we take lanes and narrow them to create additional space for other uses? And I will also say that in designing roads this way, in designing roads for cars, we've created some significant barriers for pedestrians, like wide crossings. So one of the exciting things about road diets is that data has shown us that road diets and complete street features often slow traffic. As you narrow lanes, you slow down traffic. And this is really key because slowing down traffic saves lives. And I like this graphic a lot here because it's pretty amazing when you look at just a 10-mile-per-hour difference in speed from 40 miles per hour, where if you get hit by a car, you're most likely not walking away, to 30 miles per hour, where there's a 45% chance you're not walking away. Whereas if we lower the speed another 10 miles per hour, there is a very high likelihood that you are going to survive a crash with an automobile. And a road diet can help us do this. So here's a quick example of what a road diet can look like. So here you have a really wide lane for cars, lots of wiggle room. Drivers feel a little more comfortable and they end up going faster. There's just a lot of ambiguity here as to how cars should be positioned and what other roadway users like cyclists should be doing in this context. Versus this, where we have narrowed this lane. And frankly, if you look at it, this is where vehicles essentially were anyway, and they still have plenty of, I think this is a 12-foot lane, so there's still plenty of wiggle room, but we've also enabled this additional use for cyclists. And this is a really urban example. This is on Delancey Street in New York City. You can see the before here, pretty wide crosswalk in poor condition, a lot of ambiguity about turning for vehicles, and voila, here we go. We've shortened the crossing, added a protected bike lane, and created a lot of really clear guidance about where cars should be going as they're turning. So diving into specific design tools. So if we're talking about cycling, there's a couple different ways to facilitate cycling. One is the protected bike lane, and these are on-street lanes that are physically separated from moving traffic. And as was pioneered in New York City, we are now using vehicles that are parallel parked as a buffer from traffic, adding in a buffer to avoid dooring, and then having a bike lane directly adjacent to the curb. This can be done in two directions. It just requires a little more space. You don't necessarily have to use car parking as your barrier. In this example, you see planters. Same effect. We are physically separating cyclists from traffic. Now, that's a pretty extreme treatment. The more common approach, or you're more likely to see a lot of bike lanes propagated all over New York State. So these are just paint. These are delineated spaces with paint on the road for cyclists. In some cases, you might see them painted a solid color in a really dense urban context. and that's to add visibility so that drivers are aware of other vehicles operating in the same space. Now, in some cases, you may see shared routes. These are lanes that are designed to be shared between cars and bikes, not side by side, but in lane. These are designated on street, typically with sharrows like you see here, and a sign of some sort that indicates it's a bike route or a shared route. One sort of misnomer that I tend to see a lot is the placement of this sharrow. So a lot of municipalities tend to offset this from the center of the lane, which creates a false guidance. It encourages cyclists to sort of not take the lane and ride closer to parked cars like this, which creates dangerous scenarios for two reasons. One, it opens cyclists up to dooring from the driver's side door, but two, it encourages vehicles behind a cyclist to pass them even on a double yellow. And on a double yellow, the drivers aren't going to really want to take a lot of space. So they're going to potentially get really close to a cyclist who's sort of offset from the center lane. So if you're using shared routes, I recommend keeping them dead center lane. These are not the strongest piece of bike infrastructure, obviously. Typically, these are used in short segments to connect to stronger pieces of bike infrastructure. So let's say you have two bike lanes or a bike lane in a trail, and there's not enough space to add a protected lane or a bike lane. You might put in a shared route just to get you that extra bit of distance from one piece of bike infrastructure to another. So sidewalks. Sidewalks are really complex places. It's not just a place that we walk in sort of a commercial urban context. You have four essential parts. One is your edge zone, which is where the street meets the curb. This might include parking meters or maybe like a newspaper stand. I don't know if those are still functional in a lot of places. Next, you have your furnishing zones. This is where you're going to see street furniture, landscaping. You have your throughway zone, which is the place where pedestrians are walking back and forth. And then you have your building frontage zone. And this is the area directly up against buildings. So maybe this is a space where there's outdoor dining. Maybe there's, things being sold in this space. There's a lot you can do with those different pieces of the sidewalk. In a more rural context, you still have similar breakdown, but somewhat different uses. So you still have that edge zone where the street meets the curb, but instead of that furnishing zone, you have a curb or a planter zone. So you're likely going to see grass and trees here. You're probably not going to see a lot of street furniture or outdoor seating. You still have that throughway zone, which is really key for people to walk back and forth. And then you have a frontage zone that can look very different in different contexts. So here, this is a retaining wall. It could be someone's lawn. There's still something there. It just might look very different. And we can do different things with these different zones. I think what's really key on any sidewalk, you see there's a really nice dense tree canopy here. That's a feature that I think is really important. You read a lot about urban island heating effect and how disadvantaged communities tend to not have as much tree cover. That's something to think about in both a rural and an urban context. So in really low density areas, it might not be advantageous to put in a sidewalk, but there are side paths and shared use paths. And these are essentially trails, mixed use trails for cyclists and drivers. Cyclists and walkers. And these are really great because they're fun to bike and walk on. They connect long distances, and it saves you from having to put in a sidewalk that may or may not be used very frequently. Now, what's important with shared use sidewalks and side paths is thinking about connections, both on and off road. So in this case, you see this is a really good design example. What do you do with pedestrians? What do you do with cyclists? So making sure that cyclists have a way to transition both back on road and onto the trail. And presumably there's like a facility or something here for pedestrians to go to. That's really important. So next, curb extensions. So one of the big challenges we talked about with roadway design was designing really wide streets for cars. Curb extensions are a tool we can use to shorten the distance between the curb and shorten the crossing. Curb extensions also serve a number of really great functions in that they protect cars from turning vehicles. They also slow down traffic. So I love curb extensions. I think they're really helpful. Curb extensions can be hard in concrete, like you see here, or they can just be in paint and bollards, like you see right here. And in this case, this curb extension is so large, it actually becomes a new public space. Speed bumps, everybody knows the speed bump. These are great for, slowing down traffic, reminding cars that or drivers that they can't just speed up after they, enter a specific zone. So you can put these periodically, say in a school zone or elsewhere, like a main street commercial context. These can be permanent or they can be bolted in, like you see with these rubberized versions here. Crosswalks. So crosswalks are another really important tool when we're thinking about pedestrian safety and mobility. The key with crosswalks is increasing visibility. So, in this case, making sure that you're using reflective paint, where you can, shortening the crossing. So you see a wide crossing here. I imagine this was originally a diagonal crossing, but with the center median, they were able to create two short, really safe crossings here. Also, depending on how much you're able and willing to invest, pedestrian beacons are great for sort of alerting drivers. And if you really want to get funky, I saw this in Spain where this crosswalk is pressure sensitive. So if you step on the crosswalk, these LEDs turn on while you're crossing, and then drivers have to yield, and then they sort of blink and they turn off, and then cars can go again. So there's just tons and tons of tools, all aimed at making crosswalks shorter and more visible. Parking. Parking's a problem in every community I go to. There's lots of different types of parking. Typically we see a lot of parallel parking. Angled parking is the worst. And frankly, we're seeing less and less angled parking, particularly in New York State. What's happening in place of angled parking, one, we're seeing conversions to parallel parking, or we're seeing conversions to reverse angle parking. Now, it's a little counterintuitive if you've spent your life pulling into spaces front first, but when you do reverse angle parking, it gives you a 180-degree view as you are pulling out of the space. So you can see who's coming to your left, what's happening on your right, and it is 100% safer than backing out of angled parking. The only thing I will say about angled parking, though, is it is a little bit of a paradigm shift. So if you're going to do something like this, it's really important to educate the community about what you're doing ahead of time and how it works. And every community that does this has an actual regulatory sign that doesn't just say, caution, reverse angle parking. It actually has the instructions on it. And it's some form of 1, 2, 3, so that people know what they're supposed to do. Bike parking. Bike parking is really important if you want to facilitate cycling. It's not just about creating safe routes, but cyclists want to feel confident that their bike is going to be in a safe place when they get to their destination. But what's great about bike parking is that it's also a really exciting placemaking tool. So, your bike rack doesn't just have to be a metal U. It can be branded to your local library. It can be sculptural, like you see with this apple here. So think about how you can use bike parking to sort of maximize that sense of place. The ultimate evolution of bike parking is a bike corral, like you see examples here. I like this car, it's very tongue-in-cheek. Now, yes, this does require a parking space, but again, remember what I said about highest and best use. If you have a population that you think is amenable to biking, and you can fit 8 cyclists in the space where you can park 1 car, what is the highest and best use of that space? Especially if we're talking about like an urban context, or a commercial context outside of a cafe or something along those lines. ADA accessibility, we could spend an entire webinar talking about this in particular, but needless to say, there are a lot of tools out there that are designed to help us ensure that our public spaces, our sidewalks, our streets are accessible for people of all abilities. So, thinking about ADA compliant curb ramps, thinking about those who are visually impaired, how can we accommodate different usage? Streetscaping and public art, very important. Number one, this gets us to that placemaking like I've been talking about. And number two, studies have shown us that street art, like you see here, this street paint slows traffic. So we can use public art as not just that placemaking tool, but a traffic calming measure. And just as a case study here in Rochester, they have something called a Boulevard program where they go out and they create designs for intersections, which again is it's great for placemaking. It's great for building community. It's great for traffic calming. Environmental consideration. So here's another topic we could spend an entire webinar going through, but needless to say, there is an entire ecosystem of environmental considerations, from stormwater runoff to street trees to planters and so on. So this is something that's critically important in any context, whether it's urban, whether it's rural. And that is a very high level overview of design, right? So we barely scratch the surface on what's out there and what's possible. There's a ton of guidance. I would encourage you all to look at these NACTO guides just for inspiration about how you can apply different sidewalk and street treatments. If you're interested in doing anything on state roadways or getting state funding, you're more than likely going to need to look to AASHTO guides. So AASHTO has a bicycle facilities guide. And NYSERDA has a great guide on freight mobility if you're looking to figure out how you deal with trucks better on your streets. So with that, let's take a walk. Let's do our walk audit. Before I do that, though, I'm sorry, are there any questions about complete street design tools for infrastructure? Okay, hearing none. Let's take a walk. So when I do a walk audit, typically there are three things. Number one is to be careful. I am going to trust everybody's safe behind the computers. So number two is to think of all users. And, Katie and I were talking about this before we got started. You may pass the same intersection, the same sidewalk every single day and not give it a second thought. It works for you, no problem, move along. But how would a cyclist interact with your roadway conditions? How would someone in a wheelchair feel about a specific intersection? So I try to get people to think about different perspectives for different users. And the last thing that I typically do on a walk audit, if we were in person, I would sort of poll the audience and say, okay, there are, if you were to rate this on a scale of 0, which is, terrible, to 10, which is amazing, where would you all rate this intersection? We can't do that, so I'm going to sort of narrate for you. Bear in mind the limitations of a virtual walk audit. We're not able to observe cars. We're not able to observe pedestrians. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning here, for some reason, Google Street View doesn't work in Dover. It's just black. So we're only working with aerial imagery. So bear with me. There's probably things that I'm not seeing or we're not getting. That said, our first stop here is Mill Street at the Metro North crossing. And if I were to rate this on my scale of 0 to 10, I would probably give it a 1. And the reason I would give it a 1 and not less is because there's transit present, which is great. It's nice to have transit. But there's a lot of issues here. There's an informal curb around the rail crossing. There's no crosswalks that I can see from aerial imagery. There's no parking protection. It just sort of starts or ends here. So if a vehicle's turning, Who knows? I mean, where does the parking start? Where doesn't it? Um, you have a little bit of parking protection here with this bump out, but from what I can see, it's very informal. There's no real curb. So a lot of issues. One of the things I didn't point out, I know there are rail gates here, but there's no stopping bars. So just a lot of things going on that I don't think are particularly safe. Also, these crossings, aside from the fact that there's no sidewalk here, these crossings are wider than they need to be, especially here on Railroad Street. So if I were to try to think about taking this from my self-assigned 1 to, let's say, maybe 5, here are some of the things I would do. 1, formalize these curbs and extend them so that we have very clear areas for crosswalks to land in. Second, I would add crosswalks. So it's very clear if you're walking to transit, here's where you cross, here's where you cross to get to the train. Similarly down here, I would add a curb extension to sort of square off this turn and shorten this crossing with a new crosswalk. And I think most importantly here, I would add stopping bars for the railroad so per MUTCD guidelines, they're supposed to be approximately 8 feet from the gate, but at absolute no less than 15 feet from the bar, not from the bar, from the rails. So I think these are really important here for no other reason than to add visibility for drivers. It's a little scary. If it's just a gate and the gate starts coming down, I mean, as a driver, I would think, oh my God, what should I do? Should I stop? Should I go? If you have the bar in place and you're at the bar, well, you stop at the bar. Very easy. There's no pressure. It just makes sense and makes the street a lot more orderly. One thing I want to say before I move on here, this is not the end all be all treatment for this intersection. As I said, I'm not trying to get us to 10. I'm trying to get us to 5, because at the end of the day, if we just use paint, we can do a lot and we don't have to spend a lot of money. There is certainly a lot more you could do with this intersection if we have a lot of capital to spend. But if we can at least make it safer with paint, it's great, right? We don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money to make this a safer intersection. So Route 22 and Mill Street, a couple good things here. If I were to rate this, I would give this a strong 4. You've got a pretty good looking sidewalk, very clear crosswalks here. This driveway is set back quite a ways from the intersection, so you're not having conflicts with vehicles turning in and out of this parking area. At the same time, there are some limitations I see. One, this is a really wide crossing for pedestrians. And on that note, this is a very wide turn for vehicles. So not only will this take pedestrians a lot longer, but you have a higher risk of sort of a hook or getting hooked from turning vehicles. And lastly, there's only a single crossing here. And, again, I can't see what's on the ground, but from what I can see above, I don't see any reason why we couldn't have a second crossing, especially when there's a potential trip generator right here across the street. So very simple. If I were to take this from a 4 to say a 6, I would add in a large curb extension to sort of square off this road. So there's a much clearer 90-degree turn. And I would add a crosswalk here. And again, these are small improvements. These are things that we can do in just paint. Lastly, Route 22 and Dover Village Plaza. If I were to rate this, I am sorry to say that I would give it I struggled, but I would give it a 1. I wanted to give it a 2 because there's a nice sidewalk. But the problem with that sidewalk is it's a sidewalk to nowhere, and it's a long sidewalk to nowhere. So, if you're here, and you want to cross the street, you have to walk all the way up here, and then you have to stand here, and then you have to cross to this sort of grassy knoll here where there's no landing. There's also no crosswalk here. And this is a pretty wide road. This is a 40-foot road. And sure, there's a wide shoulder, but that isn't the same as having a pedestrian lane. One thing that I will say is good, and this is a pet peeve of mine, but I like the fact that there is consistent crosswalk design. One of the things that drives me nuts is when I go to a community and a crosswalk is designed sort of like a stepladder in one place, and then it's just 2 bars in another place. I know why it happens. I know, one agency owns this roadway and another agency owns that roadway, but it doesn't create that consistency for pedestrians. And it's not a barrier per se, but it makes things feel disjointed. So if I were to try to enhance this intersection, what would I do? I would, at a bare minimum, try to shorten this crossing with some curb extensions, add in a sidewalk here so that you can get to these various crosswalks. And I would add some pedestrian beacons here so that there is visibility, particularly on Route 22 here, where cars may or may not be sort of inclined to stop. Now, one other thing that I might consider here, again, not knowing the context, but I would consider putting this crossing over here so that you don't have this long stretch of sidewalk. But again, I'm not trying to, blow our budget here. This is sort of working within the bounds of what we have. That's our walk audit. I'm sorry I blew through that, but I want to make sure we get through the rest of our content. Any questions on those intersections or why I treated them the way I did? One caveat to that, which is those are not necessarily my, if I were hired to redesign those intersections, that's not necessarily what I would do. But these are ideas for inspiration. These are things you can do. These are ways you can apply those different design tools to those contexts.
Hey, Dan, I don't know if you have time, but it might be useful for me at least to go back to those 3 spots and just hear from the group, what they think of the issues you identified first, if those reflect their experience, and then any thoughts on, the practicality or the usefulness of what you've suggested doing.
Sure. 5 minutes. Let's go.
Dan, for this one, Route 22 and Dover Village Plaza, when you say curb cuts, is that a green area or a concrete area?
Yeah, what I'm suggesting here are curb extensions. So these are basically painted bump outs that enable pedestrians to stand in a space that is currently a shoulder. It also, if we put up some bollards or other barriers, it forces vehicles to make a complete turn rather than taking a wider turn. And this can be done in paint or it can be done in concrete.
Mm-hmm. One of our thoughts was to try to build a sidewalk from this plaza, back into the hamlet, because it, right now folks are walking on dirt to the post office is the bigger structure on the right-hand side. So this is a busy intersection, a Dunkin' Donuts, a bank, a car auto place. So would that be a place for a sidewalk?
100%. Yeah. There's the question that you're going to run into is right-of-way ownership. And that's going to potentially, unless there's existing easements in place, you might have some challenges with property owners, depending on where it's going to be. That said, if you go to any of these local businesses and say, hey, we know this is a busy place, we want to make it more accessible. Can you give us an easement? I would be surprised if they didn't, but it seems strange.
Well, this is Route 22, so wouldn't it be a state DOT?
What I'm saying is, see this right here, this grassy knoll. So yeah. If you wanted to put a sidewalk in, say here, right? This isn't Route 22. This has to do with property ownership. So again, I don't know who owns this, but that might be a challenge that you run into with a sidewalk. I think it's a great idea. You need more sidewalks.
Well, we all know who owns it, so, yep. But that is a good thing in a way, because, approaching somebody we know is easier than approaching somebody we don't know.
Yeah. Other questions or thoughts on these intersections?
Yeah, Dan, hi, this is Kevin. I'm actually with the fire department. I'm representing them on this project.
Mm-hmm.
And this actual intersection and just up a little bit further north is one of the largest areas that we have for motor vehicle accidents and incidents within the town, because you have heavy traffic coming north and south. What other traffic calming systems are available to kind of mitigate the speed of vehicles coming in? Obviously, we can't put speed bumps because it's a state highway, it's a main thoroughfare. But what other traffic calming devices are available for this? It's not just this intersection, it actually goes up past the plaza, almost up to our fire department.
Sure. So, I think you hit the nail on the head here with the state roadway challenge. That's not a unique issue. Almost virtually every community that I've worked in New York State has some sort of state roadway that they can't touch, that creates challenges for them. So I feel you. One of the things that I would recommend is look at off-street infrastructure, might be able to install within your roadway. So, for example, if I'm sure DOT would have pushback about this, but I'm not sure what they could do if you own the right of way. Why not put in a speed counter so that people can see how fast they're going at a particular intersection? If you talk to DOT, if this is a real problem and you have the data to support that, you might be able to talk to DOT about some design enhancements. So if there's another intersection, it sounds like, maybe putting in some curb bump outs around that intersection to slow traffic as cars are going through. That might be something you can do to slow down traffic. There's only so much you can do without adapting the physical design of the roadway. So I don't know how much contact you have with DOT, but it is worth a conversation with your regional engineer. You can also reach out to your, bicycle and pedestrian, your regional bicycle and pedestrian coordinator. I forget the name for Dutchess County, but their job is to think about places in their region where they could be internal advocates for complete street treatments, facilitate pedestrian mobility and bicycle mobility. So that might be another avenue you can explore to sort of get at DOT and start thinking about how they can adapt their roadway to make it safer. You've got the data for sure. But again, I'm sorry, I'm just talking here, but it's without seeing the specific area, it's hard for me to give you a complete answer.
No, you've kind of touched on my what I'm looking for. The other quick question I had was, when we met as a team the first time, we had another junction, which was the School Street Route 22 interface. Did you actually, I know it's not on the presentation, but did you get a chance to look at that one?
No, I haven't actually.
Okay.
But that's definitely an area. Is it currently a slow zone, a school zone?
It's a weird one because it's opposite our fire department, but more importantly, we have this touristic feature called Stone Church, and pretty much from Easter through till probably whatever the holiday is in October, Columbus Day, we get a lot of hikers coming in, and they have to cross from the school side across Route 22 by our fire department. And there is a crossing there, but there's no flashing beacons. It's poorly managed, and people just don't slow down. When we first met, it was one of the ones that I was asked to bring up to the team, was that it was firstly this one we're talking about here, because we see so many motor vehicle accidents. But secondly is for the hiker side of things. But I just wondered if you'd had a chance to look at it.
Yeah, unfortunately not, but I think it's great to raise that for Emily, and to think about that as you're going through this process. So
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to pause there. Well, I'm not going to pause. I'm going to keep going. And we're going to talk about complete street policy. So I'm going to be a light touch. We only have 30 minutes, and I want to get through content and give you all a chance to ask any follow-up questions. So with policy, why do communities need a complete street policy? Well, Policies are important because it's an official mandate to work towards an integrated transportation network for all users, as well as the establishment of a reporting framework so that we can track the success of street improvements. And one of the things that a really good complete street policy will do is prioritize design treatment. So think back to the stepladder that we saw earlier in the presentation design section. Your policy can include that sort of prioritization so that it's never a question. You know, in this case, on a primary arterial in a downtown, we're going to be prioritizing investments in pedestrian zones. Whereas in sort of an industrial area on a major collector route, we're going to be prioritizing investments in turning lanes and travel lanes. So this is actually an excerpt from Albany's Complete Street Policy and Design Guide. I'd suggest you check it out, but policies can be really robust or they can be sort of pro forma. And when you have a complete street policy, there's a lot of things you can put in there, but the basic essentials are these. If you've ever actually read a complete street policy that's been adopted by a village, a town, a city, etc., there's a lot of whereas language, and each of these represents one of their whereases. So there's a community vision. What is Dover's definition of complete streets? That's the vision. There's the policy intent. So what is Dover trying to do here? Scope of applicability is what stakeholders are involved in this, who's it going to impact, what entities is the city going to partner with, and what sort of compliance documentation is going to be required to get this done. When it comes to projects and phasing, that sort of lays out what your actual action items are going to be. So what types of work you're going to be doing. Exceptions, this is where a lot of complete street policies sort of fall on their face. If your exceptions aren't really well thought through, and they're sort of broad and enable anybody to get an exception, your policy is going to be completely ineffective, versus having a really rigorous process in place to say, no, wait, why are you trying to get an exception? We should be thinking about complete streets for this project. The commitment to the integrated transportation network essentially says that none of the work we're going to do moving forward is going to happen in a vacuum. We're going to try to create connectivity on our sidewalks, on our streets, with transit, etc., so that people can get from one mode to another easily. Mandated design standards are essentially what Dover is going to turn to when we're trying to figure out the actual design on the street. So, your DPW or the county might have a typical design standard that is applied, but it's up to you to figure out, oh, do we want to pull in some NACTO standards that we can draw on? Do we want to bring in those AASHTO standards? What are the standards we're going to look to when we're actually drawing out our design? Context sensitivity, we want to make sure that we are doing things to preserve the character and integrity of our environment. We're not going to put a treatment that makes no sense. So we're not going to put a 5-mile protected bike lane in an area that, has very, very, very low traffic volume. Performance measures, really critical. What sort of key performance indicators are we looking towards to track and manage success? And then implementation mandates. This is where the rubber really hits the road. These are, where does Dover want to be in 1, 3, and 5 years? What sort of trainings and documents are required to implement the policy? How frequently are we going to do evaluations, and so on and so forth? These are the pieces that are typically included in a complete street policy. Did I miss something? So something else, I talked about school zones earlier. You can wrap sort of design packages into your policy, and this is typically applicable to bigger communities, but there's no reason you can't do it on local streets. If you create a local school zone, criteria, that can be baked into your policy. Similarly, here's a case study from New York City. New York City created these neighborhood slow zones, which again, it's a design package. They created criteria that says, okay, we can take, if you apply for this program, we can take a 5-block radius and we have a package of design treatments to A, lower the speed limit, B, increase bike accessibility, C, increase pedestrian safety, and we can do all these things in a targeted fashion. So again, there's different things you can bake into your policy so that, it's very easy to just say, hey, we want to put a neighborhood slow zone over there, or we want to make sure that any area like X, Y, or Z includes a sidewalk. And again, some resources on the policy front. Albany has a really great policy and design manual, and I showed you a piece of it earlier. And then Smart Growth America has this local policy workbook, which is very helpful in formulating your complete street policy. So let's talk about implementation. I will pause for questions in a bit, but let me get through this section. So implementation, here we go. We've made it. This is complete streets. Goodbye. Looks great, doesn't it? Everybody's happy. There's street trees. Everybody's out, in different modes. Hooray. How complicated can this be? Well, first, you've got your local DPW or Department of Transportation who's going to be managing the street. Unless it's New York State DOT, then you have a transit agency running through your community. So you have to coordinate with them, particularly with buses and bus stops and things of that nature. But even with Metro North, you need to be thinking about the station context, right? And Metro North will have something to say about that. The Chamber of Commerce also has a say. So in your commercial context, they're going to care about what you're doing with parking. They're going to care about how people are getting to their businesses. Then you have very diverse groups of stakeholders. You have cyclists, you have the elderly, you have, young joggers, you have people in wheelchairs, like all of these different considerations sort of converging. And suddenly this idyllic landscape has gotten very complicated to implement. So it's really important to think about how individual stakeholders' concerns translate into technical issues, and then what the role of various actors are. So the transit agency, the public sector, the private sector, and advocates. This is an excerpt from the National Guide on Bike Transit Integration that I wrote for APTA. The content is not so important here as how it's organized. So for example, a customer is concerned about how they get to transit by a bicycle. From a technical standpoint, that's a safe routes to transit issue. And different partners have different roles to play. So the transit agency is more of an influencer in this context because they don't control the right of way on the street. The public sector, the municipality, the DPW, they play a lead role because ultimately they're responsible for the design and the implementation. The private sector can vary. Maybe there's an easement that they can give. Maybe they can pay for it if there's a developer. Maybe they can pay for a trail or a new bike lane or something. And advocates are the ones that are going to give you that data. They're going to push for these improvements to happen and give you the real ground flavor of what's happening there. So I show you this to provide you with a framework for thinking about implementation and how you get from, well, I want to be able to safely cross the street to a fully fleshed out design that actually exists. So when we talk about steps to implementation, first, once we have a policy in place, we restructure and update existing plans to include complete street principles. We update our design guidelines so it includes things like curb extensions, like bike lanes, like things that aren't necessarily there before we started talking about complete streets. Educating internal staff and stakeholders. So there's probably a bunch of engineers sitting somewhere that have been doing things one way for 30 years, and this is new, this is different. So how do we get that point across? How do we let them know what we're trying to achieve? Initiating pilot projects, I'll talk about in a minute. And then lastly, and I would argue almost most importantly, measuring performance. We need to be able to demonstrate the success of these things in order to keep them going and in order to maintain them. So how do we achieve complete streets? We can do it without spending a lot of money, without a lot of red tape. One of the ways we do that is with short-term pilots. This is a very, very famous pilot where in 2009, New York City DOT decided to shut down Broadway in Times Square because the sidewalks were just too tight. People were falling off the street, off the sidewalk all the time. So why not just shut it down? In order to avoid a lot of red tape and a lot of screaming, they did a pilot, and it was hugely successful. And ultimately, if you go to Times Square now, God forbid, I avoid it like the plague, but if you go there now, it has become a permanent staple. People love it. There's permanent seating. People are always walking there, and it's a huge success. And it's been expanded, not just in Times Square, but different locations down Broadway. So a pilot can help you streamline that implementation, get past red tape, demonstrate that something works, get the community engaged and get them excited, and then attract new funding sources to expand these types of principles. Another way we can implement complete streets with, not a lot of capital expenditure is with tag-along projects. So when you mill a street, you're going to have to repaint it anyway once you mill it, right? So why not just change the design in advance so that when your street painter comes out, he has a complete street design ready to go, ready to implement. That avoids you the capital cost of, erasing and restriping the street. It avoids the staging costs associated with that. You're able to get a lot of bang for the taxpayer's buck by just creating a new design in advance. So a couple myths about complete streets that tend to hold up implementation. Let's go through them. So first, businesses often get upset, especially if you start to take away parking. But studies show that the opposite is true. Businesses abutting complete street infrastructure, things like large curb extensions and bike lanes, tend to see increased commercial activity and increased customer satisfaction at the businesses. And also business owners tend to be more satisfied in surveys of owners. Police, fire, and emergency services aren't going to have access anymore, which is false. So if a road diet ultimately opens up the street and creates a more predictable landscape, and you've seen a couple examples of that in the presentation thus far. And I think this is a good example of that. So before, you have these wide lanes just for cars. Now we've taken away some of that car space, but we've created a turning lane which can double as an emergency lane. We've added an additional use with these bike lanes. And here you go, you see it in action. Before, a fire truck has to sort of weave in and out of all this madness as cars are pulling to the side, whereas you can leverage this turning lane as that emergency lane. And also, I know it's tongue in cheek, but theoretically, if we do complete streets right, we're reducing traffic accidents and thereby reducing the need for emergency services. I get it. That doesn't necessarily reduce, fires off street or anything like that, but it's not inconceivable that there would be less need for emergency services, at least on the street, if we do these complete street treatments. We don't have the money for this. As I just showed you, you can restripe a street with almost no cost if you have a design ready to go during a street milling. Same goes for utility work, by the way. And then my favorite, it just doesn't work here. Our community is too unique, or we're not Portland, or we're not New York City, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. It's the unique elements in a community that make complete street projects really special. The whole point from the beginning, I've said, is to maximize the highest and best use of our space and create places that people want to live, work, and play in. And every community has a different flavor and a different feel. So it's important that we capitalize on those. And we, for visitors to Dover, we're showing people what Dover's all about through our streetscape. That's what we're trying to get to. So funding, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we're short on time, but there are a lot of federal funding sources out there. There's a lot of state funding sources out there. I'm sure Emily can give you a lot more information about how federal funds flow down to local communities. The MPO has a pretty important role in that. There are state funding mechanisms. There are private, like foundation grants that you can get for smaller projects. But speaking generally about funding, property owners probably are never going to fund a project, but as I've said before, you can get an easement on their property if you're trying to build a trail or a sidewalk, if they're amenable and if it adds value. Same with businesses. Businesses aren't most likely going to pay for a bike lane or a bike corral necessarily, but if you can demonstrate value to customers and employees, they might fund even if they don't fund a bike corral in front of their business. Let's say we're talking about a cafe, they might agree to pay for its maintenance and operation. And that's actually what happens in New York City. Anytime there's a bike corral in front of a business, DOT pays for it and installs it, and then the businesses make sure it stays clean, they report any abandoned bikes, and so on. Businesses might also grant easements. Again, if you have a trail in the back that their employees and customers can use to get to their business, you might be able to get an easement on their property. Developers bring a lot of money to a community, and you do have a lot of power here. You never want to push it. You definitely want to attract business. You don't want to put them away and be overly restrictive, but there's no reason you can't tell a developer, hey, we've been trying to complete a trail that abuts your property for years. If you want to come to our community, we'd like you to fund that. Or at the bare minimum, make sure that all of the crosswalks the crosswalks and the curb cuts within a 2-block radius of your development are ADA compliant. So that's funding. Let's just blow through evaluation real quick, and then we will round things out with questions. So evaluation is really critical. There's a lot of things we can measure when it comes to complete streets. There's sort of short-term outcomes here in green, like crashes, vehicular volume, traffic speed, economic vitality, and user satisfaction. And then there's big picture downstream metrics like environmental outcomes, public health outcomes, and public safety. So when you're trying to build a data set around complete street, one, you need to prioritize the outcomes that are important to your community. Safety is always going to be, number one, but maybe economic development is really important. Maybe air quality is important. Again, I can't tell you what your priorities are, but start there. Once you have those priorities, you determine the methodology. How are we going to measure those things? Then before you do whatever complete street project, establish a baseline. Make sure you have some initial data. This is where crashes stand today at this intersection. That's an easy one, right? You definitely track crashes, and you can definitely do some research ahead of time. And then set a regular schedule for evaluation. So once you do a complete street project, how frequently are you going to monitor these KPIs to make sure that it's an effective use of our dollars and our time? So going through each of the metrics that I talked about before, crash data is very common. Your police department's going to collect this in some form or another. Every police department has a different level of granularity that they collect this to, depending on how dense the environment is. But you can always get this data somewhere. Traffic volume, lots of different ways to measure traffic volume. You can look at the number of cars, bikes, or pedestrians on the street. At an intersection, you can do what are called vehicle turning counts, and you can see, okay, at this intersection, we tend to see 10 vehicles making right turns versus 5 vehicles going straight, midday in the fall. There are different ways to do this. There's the intern method, as I call it. Those are manual counts. I've done them many times, and they're fun, and then they're not after a lot of them. And then there's automatic ways. There's pneumatic tubes. You've probably seen those strips across streets from time to time. You can do video analytics, which takes a little bit of time, but it's pretty effective. And then there are permanent counters, like you see on the right here. This is mainly on trails and when we're counting cyclists and pedestrians. Traffic speed, again, your police should have at least speeding data. So if you're not regularly monitoring speeds, or you're not going out and doing a speed study, you can go to your police department and say, hey, we want to know where the highest instances of speeding are in our community. They can give you that data. Economic vitality, there's a number of different things. So commercial activity, businesses may or may not be forthcoming about how like their revenue, but you can always look at sales tax receipts from businesses in your community. As far as business engagement, you can go out and you can do counts of visitors that are in local establishments. You can look at pedestrians seated outside if you have any outdoor seating. You can do user surveys. You can survey business owners. Commercial vacancies are a pretty big indicator of economic vitality, especially in your denser commercial core. And you can look at the number of building permits. You can look at the number of vacant storefronts. Just a lot of different ways that we can sort of slice and dice economic vitality. Downstream outcomes, public health, we can look at asthma rates and obesity rates, public safety. It's interesting, the crime rate can go down fairly quickly if you do different things with a main street or a particular area. But I've found that perceptions of safety take a longer time to change. So, if you do surveys, you would get at that kind of data. And then environmental, air quality and water quality take time to change unless you have a COVID level event where people suddenly stop driving. Tools and resources for data collection. All of this will be in the bibliography that I provide to Katie after the training, along with a copy of the slides here. So to review, active transportation is any self-propelled human-powered mode of mobility. Complete streets are streets designed for everyone. There are many tools, like a lot that we didn't even talk about today, to achieve complete streets. Complete streets should seek to establish integrated transportation connections between modes, so transit, pedestrians, bicyclists, and cars. Don't forget about freight mobility. It's really important. Complete streets policies set the tone and establish guidelines for future street improvements. Implementation is complicated, but we can streamline it with cooperation from partner agencies and education of key stakeholders. Evaluation is absolutely critical to tracking success and setting community goals. And with that, we can take the last 5 minutes for any remaining questions.
Dan?
Yeah.
How does complete streets and our pedestrian plan overlap, but at the same time kind of parallel so that we can get the benefit of both of them?
Yeah, so complete streets is a concept, right? And your pedestrian plan is, falls under that umbrella. And also, complete street improvements don't necessarily happen in a vacuum. So like I said, if you're trying to, let's say, shorten a pedestrian crossing, right? If you put a curb bump out in one place, or like mid-block, let's say, and you shorten that crossing for pedestrians, not only are you making things better for pedestrians, but you're also making it better for other roadway users. Vehicles have more visibility on pedestrians. Vehicles are ultimately going to slow down as they approach a narrow roadway. So your pedestrian plan is a key piece of achieving complete streets.
And Katie, just to add to that, we identified some focus areas. And so I think kind of building on what Dan showed with some ideas, we're going to try to come up with, as a group, with some design improvements for those key locations. And so those will be informed by complete streets principles. So, we'll want to think about who's the kind of priority user. It's probably the person walking, and accessibility is going to be a key component of those design concepts. So, the concept of complete streets is going to definitely inform how we, try and come up with design ideas for those key focus areas.
Mm-hmm. That's great. We are a climate smart community. We have certification at the bronze level, and complete streets policy is another action item that we can achieve points towards. Is it a document or a resolution that's adopted by the town board?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd encourage you to look at those guides that I pointed out, particularly the Smart Growth America workbook, because that's going to have a lot of good detail about how you put together a policy. I am also going to send you, along with the presentation slides and the bibliography, I will send you a model complete streets policy that's just sort of the baseline. which absolutely needs to be tailored, but essentially gets all of those key whereases outlined in brief.
Great. Does anyone else have questions? Okay. Dan, that was inspiring. I could just imagine all the great things that could happen in the Dover Plains hamlet. And then, taking it the next step to the Wingdale hamlet. And you gave me ideas that I never, even with bike, travel, I never thought were possible in Dover Plains.
That's great. I'm so thrilled to hear that. And I'm very excited for you guys to go about this pedestrian planning process. And it's going to be great for your community, and you're in great hands with Emily. And I think I will be back to hear how things are going. But in the meantime, again, stay tuned. Katie, I will send these to you and you can disseminate them to the group, but I have a variety of resources, including the bibliography, the slides, the model complete street policy, which I think will be helpful as you take the next steps.
Excellent. Well,
and Katie, I just want to add one plug. The field work we're going to be doing, some of it is kind of routine data collection, but some of it we're going to be, in the community looking at those key locations, like some of the intersections. And since we weren't able to do the, real walk audit with Dan today, that's an opportunity to kind of do a walk audit in a way. So if people I know some people from the task force were interested, if we can have a group of people with us when we're walking through those intersections, we can do kind of a walk audit, while we're there. Just that'll be a great opportunity to talk in more detail about some of these challenges at those key locations.
Well, I'll help to work that every time you're out, that we can try to get you at least one person, hopefully more, that can, spend some time to, give you some insights about the different areas. So that's terrific. So, anyone else have any questions? All right. Well, we have met our 7:30 mark there. So Dan, thank you for being right on target. That is excellent. And thank you, Emily, for being with us tonight. Tara also. Thank you all. If we're all set, I think we'll close for now, and I'll plan to be in touch next week, just with an email follow-up to see who might be available for the walk audit field work that's going to take place on May 6th, May 10th, and May 13th. So, all right, thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye, everyone. Good luck.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Stop. No. Which one? Which one? Oh, this one.